All right, we're continuing our survey through the book of Ezekiel. We're ready for chapters 27 to 29. This is in the nations section, three major sections to the book of Ezekiel, as we have in the case of Isaiah and Jeremiah. And we're in the nations section. We're not going to take a great deal of time reviewing all of that we talked about last week, but the value of the nations section. Quite often in studying the prophets, when we come to these sections, it gets kind of uninteresting to some people, and they're ready to skim through it as quickly as they can and just forget about the section, because this really doesn't apply to the nation of Judah, doesn't apply to Israel, doesn't apply to us, they think. But there is value in the nations sections. An argument for the fact of the value is the fact that God wrote it and put it here for us to read. And so it's a rather lengthy section, 25 to 32. I mean, by lengthy, I mean it's more than just a verse or two. There are several chapters devoted to the nations. But anyway, what we're learning from that is that God is in control. God rules in the nations, that the nations are subject to God as well as individuals being subject to God. And so God can use nations as tools. We're going to see that specifically tonight with reference to Babylon. God can use a nation as a tool. We've mentioned that time and again, but we learned that from these studies. And then there's some practical things. The same thing that brings a nation down brings an individual down. We're going to see a nation falling because of its pride. The same thing happens to individuals. They got impressed with riches and they fell. Well, that same thing can happen to us as individuals. I call attention to the last question on your handout because it deals with the 8 times in this lesson where it is said, "Then shall they know that I'm the Lord." Watch for those, and that is your last question. We'll flag those as we go along. There's 63 total in the book. 8 of those are found in our study tonight. So here's what's going on in the nations section. Here are the nations dealt with. He goes in clockwise fashion, starting with the nation of Ammon, then he moves to Moab, and then he moves to Edom, and then over to the seacoast, Philistia, and then up the seacoast to the Phoenicians, and deals with the city of Tyre. And we're still talking about Tyre tonight. Then we'll move from there to Sidon, which is also a Phoenician city. And then we'll move from there over to Egypt. And there's a great deal of attention given to Egypt. In fact, chapters 29, 30, and 31, and 32 are all devoted to Egypt. 7 prophecies concerning Egypt. And you're going to be looking for those prophecies as we go along. Here's what we've seen so far. We saw Ammon, Moab, and Edom, and Philistia, and the destruction of Tyre. We're looking at the cities of Tyre and Sidon, those Phoenician cities. Here is the city of Tyre. It was a prominent city, and so prominent that it is referred to more so than the nation in which it's set. It was a Phoenician city, but rather than referring to Philistia and then the Phoenicians, he talks about Tyre and then Sidon. It was a powerful city. It was a maritime city. It was known for its trade, as we're going to see in our study tonight. It thought itself to be quite powerful and influential. So why is so much attention, we raised this question last time, given to the city of Tyre, where maybe only a small section given to Sidon, maybe a small section given to Edom and to Ammon? Those were powerful and influential sections of people. But why so much attention given to Tyre? Perhaps it's because of the political dominance of the time, that it was such a powerful influence at the time that time and attention needs to be given to the city of Tyre. Now, let's talk about what happened to Tyre. Last time we talked about how Nebuchadnezzar had embarked upon a siege that lasted for 13 years, and that is he fought against the city for 13 years. And he took the major mainland section, the old Tyre mainland city, but was not ever able to capture that island part of the city, which was out here on the seacoast, off of the seacoast. But it wasn't until 332 BC that Alexander the Great built a causeway across from the ruins of the old city, and then he captured the city and destroyed it. And that seems to be alluded to in chapter 26. All right, we're ready for chapter 27 now. Chapter 27, still talking about Tyre. And so what we saw in chapter 26, Tyre is going to be destroyed. Tyre is going to be overthrown like other nations because of their sin. All of these nations that are where destruction is headed, it's because of their sin. So chapter 27 now, let's work through it. As we work through each chapter, I'm going to stop and come back and list some practical things. So here's the lamentation over the ruin of Tyre. The first 11 verses compares Tyre to a beautiful ship. And it's because it is a maritime city, because of their trade that was exchanged by ship. So ships were coming to their ports constantly. Ships were going out of their ports constantly. And so that's how they made their money. That's how they became rich. We see more about that as we go along. He pictures Tyre like a ship that is a beautiful ship. And so let's see what he says in verses 1 through 11. Here's what he says about a ship. First of all, he says, this ship was great and it's beautiful. But before he gets to the demonstration of the ship or the illustration, notice at verse 3 he said, and say to Tyre, you are situated at the entrance of the sea, merchants of the people on many coastland. And thus says the Lord God, O Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Here is her pride. She boasts of her greatness. So the city of Tyre had boasted about how great they were, how powerful they were, how influential they were, and how that perhaps no one can overtake us. Nebuchadnezzar comes and he fights against us, and he never was able to completely take us. Maybe that's the kind of thing. We are powerful, we're beautiful, we're a great city. But now beginning at verse 4, notice at verse 4 he said, your borders are in the midst of the sea. Your builders have perfected your beauty. It pictures it as a ship now that has been made, and it is a ship that is great and it's beautiful. It's a ship, if you personified the ship is talking to itself and said, I'm the biggest and the best and the greatest ship around. And the builders have perfected the beauty of the ship. This is no ship like this ship. Well, what else does it say about the ship? Well, notice in verses 5 to 7, it was made of the finest materials. And let me footnote to say what that says is they had every opportunity. They had every opportunity to do good. They had every kind of chance for influence for good because of their riches and because of their power. But there was no expense spared. They were made of fir trees and the cedars of Lebanon to make their masts. The oaks of Bashan made their oars. There were inlaid planks with ivory from Cyprus. There was the finest of materials that came from Egypt to make their sails. The blue and purple from the coast of Elisha had covered them. So it had the finest of materials. No expense had been spared on this ship. You had everything going for you. More about that in a moment. Now, beginning at verse 8 through 11, they had the best crew. You can have the best airplane, but if you don't have a good crew, then that's not the best plane to be on. Or the same thing with a bus, or the same thing with a car, whatever the case may be. But here was the finest ship that had the best of the crew. What did he say about the crew? Well, beginning at verse 8, the inhabitants of Sidon are your oarsmen, your own wise men. Tyre boasts of great wise men. Your own wise men were the pilots. And so not only was it the best of materials, it had the best of pilots, the wisest. You think you're the wise people? Well, then just picture the wisest of you as being the pilots. The elders of Gebal and its wise men were those who were the caulkers for the seams. What does that refer to? Well, in the ancient ships, being made of wood, there were times that there would be problems with the seams. And so there would be the caulkers that would go along with them, and they would repair those seams. In fact, some translation talks about repairmen who would repair the seams. So you would want the best of repairmen. If you're out on a wooden ship and it may spring a leak or a seam come loose, you want the top craftsman who can fix that to be with you. And they had the best craftsmen. They had the best caulkers who could fix every seam and every problem that comes along. Well, what else did they have? Notice beginning at verse 10 that they're from Persia, Libya, and Lydia. They were the army of men of war. They hung their shield and their helmets with you. So the finest of the military came and they hung their helmets with you and their armor with you, decorated the ship, gave it prestige. And notice at verse 11, there were men of Arvad in your army and your walls all around, and they hung their shields on your walls, and they made your beauty perfect. Already the best and the most beautiful ship. And now it's set off with all of these shields and all these helmets around. It has the best crew. Every opportunity to do good this city had. And so it was like a beautiful ship that had everything going in its direction. Now, Beginning at verse 12 through verse 25, Tyre was like this wealthy ship that can trade at any port. Now picture yourself as a ship, and you've got one piece of merchandise. I don't mean one, but one type of merchandise that you can trade, and not everybody needs that. Then that limits your ability for income and for trade, because not everybody needs that. But they traded with everybody. Now notice that what is described in 12 to 25 is basically the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea. He mentions Tarshish at verse 12. Well, Tarshish was over here at Spain. And then the next that he mentions was Javan, and Javan is at Greece. And then the next place it's mentioned, let's see, verse 12, Tabal is a part of Asia Minor over here. So basically he starts at one end of the sea and goes all the way to the other end of the sea. And all around that sea, they traded with everyone. Now Tyre is off over here on this coast of the Mediterranean Sea, but they traded all over the sea. And so what did they trade? Well, you might take time to underline some of the things that they were trading with and for. There was silver and iron and tin and lead at verse 12. There was bronze and human lives, perhaps that's slaves, in verse 13. There were horses and steeds and mules at verse 14. There were ivory, tusk, and ebony at verse 15. Verse 16 mentions emeralds and purple and embroidery and fine linen and corals and rubies. There was wheat of minneth and millet and honey and oil and balm in verse 17. There were all kinds of spices mentioned in verse 22 and precious stones and gold. Verse 24 mentions multicolored apparel and strong twine cord were in your marketplace. They traded everything and with everybody for everything. I mean, you had every opportunity going. You traded with all nations. You traded with it at every seaport. You were docking everywhere and trading your wares. This city had every opportunity all throughout. Now, I want you to notice now, beginning at verse 25, or ending at verse, beginning, but ending that section with verse 25 before we go to the next. The ships of Tarshish were the carriers of your merchandise, and they were filled with very glorious in the midst of, were filled and very glorious in the midst of the sea. Not only was this ship glorious, but there were other ships carrying their wares somewhere else, and their glory was noted because they were carrying from Tyre. What an opportunity this city had. It's like a beautiful ship. They traded at any port, but it was like a ship that's overloaded and it sinks. Disaster is coming. So being a maritime city, they knew about ships, so there's no better illustration to use with them that they well understand than that of a ship and a ship sinking. So notice what he said at verse 26. Your oarsmen brought you into many waters, but the east wind broke you in the midst of the sea. Again, the city's pictured like a ship, and your oarsmen took you right out. Those that were taking care of you, and the pilot and the oarsmen got you out in the middle of the waters, and the waters broke you up. Right there in the middle of the sea. Well, what happened? Well, your riches and your wares and your merchandise, verse 27, and your caulkers and your merchandise and all the men of war and the entire company, which is in your midst, fell into the sea on the day of your ruin. Remember all those great people that were the great crew that they had? They're gone. They're in the sea. Fell over in the sea. And all who handled the oar, the mariners and the pilots, will come down from the ships. So take verse 29, 30, and 31 to describe other ships. And when their oarsmen here and their pilots here, they begin to mourn. If that happened to them, that could happen to us. If that ship crashed, this ship could crash. If they were lost in the sea, we could be lost in the sea. And so here's signs of sorrow. They cry bitterly, verse 30. Put dust on their heads, and they roll about into ashes. They gird themselves with sackcloth, and they weep with bitterness of heart. In their wailing for you, they take up a lamentation for you. What city is like Tyre, destroyed in the midst of the sea? I mean, this was a great city. Who would have thought that this city would have been destroyed? Who would have thought this ship would have sunk? Who would have thought? More about that in a moment. Now, notice at verse 33, here's what they were. When your wares went out to the sea, you satisfied people and enriched the kings of the earth with your many luxury goods and your merchandise. That's what you were. Here's what you are now, verse 34. Verse 34 and 36 tell me how broken they are. Verse 34, but when you're broken by the sea in the depths of the waters, your merchandise and entire company will fall in the midst. You used to take your merchandise and kings received that. Not anymore. It's all in the ocean now. It's all down in the sea. Notice it, verse 36. The merchants among the people will hiss at you. You will become a horror and be no more forever. This great ship is ended in disaster. It is ruined. It's shipwrecked. It's completely broken up and lost all of its seamen and it's gone. And notice the phrase, you will become a horror and no more forever. You'll become a horror and no more forever. Well, that's not all about Tyre, but that's the end of chapter 27. That's into chapter 27. Let me stop for a moment and let's just get some practical things that we might learn. One of the things I'm learning through every one of these chapters, I learned it in chapter 27, 28, 29, and we'll learn it in 30 and 31, 32, and on down till we get through with the book. That God is still on his throne and he's in control. We know that. We can repeat that. We can state that. We don't always act as if we believe that. God is still on his throne and he's in control. He took Tyre down because they needed to be taken down, and God did that. More about that in a moment. But here's something else I'm learning from this. When you're talking to someone, use some illustration that they can identify with. Now, if this had been an inland city that knows nothing about ships, the illustration of a ship means nothing to them. But this is a maritime city. This is how they made their money, is by ships coming and going and being a seaport. So no wonder he uses the illustration of ships and ships falling and ships faltering and ships crashing and being drowned in the sea and all their wares going in the midst of the sea. So when you talk to somebody, find something as you talk to them about the gospel, something that they understand and they identify. Don't use something that you know well but they have no clue about. If they're interested in sports, maybe that's a good illustration. If they're interested in gardening, maybe that's a good illustration. If they're interested in racing, maybe that's a good illustration to use with them. But don't use the wrong one, something they don't have a clue what it's about. These people knew what a shipwreck was about. But here's one of the powerful lessons I learned from 27, blown opportunities. Here was a city, a nation that had every opportunity to do good, and they blew it. Could God be looking at me as a beautiful ship that was filled with the best crew, that was full of wares, and I crashed it? I blew the opportunity. Maybe I've done that. Maybe you're doing that. A lesson about blown opportunities. Here's something else I'm learning from chapter 27. We should never feel so important or so needy that nothing will happen to us. That's the way Tyre felt. If you could personify Tyre and let's converse with the city of Tyre, and Tyre would be saying to you, we're too important. We furnish everybody all their goods. We're trading with the nations. They can't live without us. We're important. We're needed. We can't fall. They did. Don't ever feel like you're so important and so needed that you can't fall. Our own success can bring us down. That's what brought them down. We're going to see more about that in chapter 28. Now, we'll move on to chapter 28. We may come back to some more practical things in a moment. Now, here's what happens in chapter 28. There's judgment against the prince of Tyre. And two things happen here. First of all, there's the haughtiness, the pride. You may be looking for that, I think. What's the sin? And it's the sin of pride. Notice at verse 1, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up and you say, I am a God, I sat in the seat of gods in the midst of the sea. Yet you are a man and not a God, though you set your heart as the heart of a God. It raises a question now, and in what sense was Tyre, the prince of Tyre, the king of Tyre, viewing himself as a god? Some question whether it was like the Roman emperors who said Caesar is Lord, and you're supposed to say Caesar is Lord and being worshiped as a god. Several question whether that's really the case. It seems to me more that he's acting as making himself as if he is self-sufficient. That's making ourselves as God. Maybe some practical application. How can we make ourselves as God? Not a one of us sitting here tonight would say, you know what, I'm God. I made all things and I'm the all-powerful. You wouldn't say that, but we sometimes act as if we are God. Also, if I act like I'm self-sufficient and I don't need anybody or anything, even God, then I am my own God. We're doing the same thing. Maybe sometimes we feel all-powerful. I'm all-powerful. There's so much that I can do. There's so many abilities that I have. And there's so much that I can accomplish. I feel all-powerful. I might be making myself as God. Or maybe, as we mentioned a moment ago, we feel too big and too important to fail. Everybody's depending on me. And so I am too big to fail. I can't. I'm making myself God. Or maybe when I think wisdom has its full dwelling in me, that I'm the one with wisdom. All wisdom resides right here. I'm making myself God. And maybe that's the idea here, that you're not God. You're not God. You're a man. Now, there's some sarcasm. You're looking for this in your handout. There's a place for sarcasm. And there's divine sarcasm. God says to the prince of Tyre, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. Do you think the prince of Tyre is wiser than Daniel? I don't think so. That's divine sarcasm. That you think you're wiser. Yeah, you're really smart. You're really wise. If they were wise, they wouldn't have crashed the boat. But here's part of how they think they're God. And that is they're wiser in their own mind than Daniel. There is no secret that cannot be hidden from you. With your wisdom and your understanding, you've gained the riches for yourself. Perhaps that's how they think they're God. We did this. We did this for ourselves. We gained this all for ourselves. Reminds us of Nebuchadnezzar and other Babylonian kings who thought they did it by their own power. Now might underline it, verse 5, that your heart is lifted up because of your riches. That could happen to any one of us, that because of whatever wealth we have, that might be $10, it might be 10 million, but you might think, because I have what I have and it's more than others, we lift up our heart and we forget about God. We don't need God as long as we have riches, we think. So he says at verse 7, I will bring strangers against you. That's Nebuchadnezzar, the most terrible nation. And they'll draw their swords against you. Now, notice at verse 9. This is quite an interesting question. What will you still say before him who slays you? I am God. And so he pictures the prince, the king of Tyre, saying, I'm God. I'm all powerful. I'm wise. And his question is, what are you going to say when Nebuchadnezzar comes and knocks on your door? You're going to say, I'm God? I think you're going to quit saying that. Are you going to do that when God's knocking at your door at judgment? Are you going to say, I'm wise, I'm powerful, I don't need God? Good question, isn't it? What are you going to do? That's the question raised at verse 9. Now, that gets us through verse 10. Haughtiness is what brought death to the prince. Then there's this lament over the king of Tyre. There's a lament over the city, thus the nation, and now over the leadership. So let's see what's said in verses 11 to 19. We shift gears at 19 and go to Sidon. So this is going to be the end of Tyre, the end of the discussion of Tyre. Now notice that there's the lament over the king of Tyre. Said, Son of man, lift up lamentation against him. But beginning at verse 13, there is a comparison to Adam. Some think this section is a description of the origin of Satan. There is no evidence of that. I'm not even going to go there. I think you're going to have to strain and stretch and pull and insert some stuff that's just not there, and there's nothing there for that conclusion. But be that as it may. He pictures the prince of Tyre like being in Eden. And notice what he says, that you were in Eden, the garden of God, very precious stones were your covering. So he had everything going his direction. The workmanship of your timbrels and your pipes was prepared. for you on the day that you were created. In other words, I created you perfect. I created you just like you should have been. Notice at verse 15, you were perfect in your ways from the day you were created. Now I might underline, till iniquity was found in you. Wasn't that true of all of us? You were perfect in the way that you were created until iniquity was found in you. We're born innocent. And we're not guilty of sin. There's nothing separating us from God. We're not saved because we've not done anything to be saved from, but we're in a safe relationship with God and a right relationship with God until iniquity was found in you. He pictures the king of Tyre as I made you and gave you every opportunity, but then there was iniquity that was found in you. Then notice, he said, at verse, let's go to verse 17. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor, and I cast you to the ground. Verse 18, you defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities. In other words, you turned to sin. And then he finally ends that, and all who knew you among the people are astonished at you. You have become a horror and shall be no more forever. Now, this is quite interesting to me that the people are astonished. What does it mean the people were astonished? I take that to mean that it's not some insignificant city or nation over here that falls and you say, well, they didn't amount to anything anyway. This is Tyre. This is a powerful city. Nebuchadnezzar's been warring against it for 13 years and was not able to capture it all. 13 years. Mighty army he had. They thought they were indestructible. And when it finally falls, people stand in horror. If that could happen to that nation, that city, it could happen to any nation. Do you ever feel like maybe the USA is indestructible? We got the most powerful military, at least we did have. I don't know if we still do, but we had the most powerful military on the earth. We're indestructible, we think. Nobody can stand against us. Nobody's got the weapons we've got. And we've got the greatest military. So we're indestructible. When this nation falls, people will be astonished. They'll be astonished. That's the point being made here. Now, let's talk about Sidon. Let's shift gears. There's a prophecy against Sidon and a promise for Israel in 28-26. We'll come back to that. Let's just see where Sidon is. Sidon just north of Tyre. It's a Phoenician city. Not as prominent as Tyre, but it was a significant city. And so there's a prophecy against it, part of this region of Phoenicia. Now, what's the prophecy against Sidon? Not much attention is given to Sidon here, just a few verses. It said, set your face toward Sidon and prophesy. I am against you, Sidon, and I'll be glorified in your midst. Here's your first of your 8. Then they shall know that I'm the Lord. So chapter 28 and verse 22 is the first time you see that. Now, before you leave that, if you're filling that box out, before you leave that, write down verse 23 also. For I will send pestilence in her and blood in her streets, and wounded shall be judged in her midst by the sword against her on every side. Then shall they know that I'm the Lord. There's your second time. So you have them 3 verses in a row. The third time's in the next verse. Verse 24, then shall they know that I'm the Lord. 3 verses in a row. Bang, bang, bang. Now, verse 24 says, and here's the question, is what did they do? What's their sin? Pride was mentioned with reference to Tyre. And they shall no longer be a pricking briar or a painful thorn for the house of Israel from among all those around them. One of those neighbors that had been a thorn in their flesh. What had they done? We're not told. I don't know what it was, but they, in some shape, form, or fashion, had been a thorn in the side of Israel. And I'm going to bring her down. That was the offense. And that's not going to happen again. Then shall they know that I'm the Lord God. There's your third time. So verse 22, 23, 24 are the 3 times. Now then, let's talk about this promise for Israel. I really should have separated that in my outline. But let's pick up at verse 25 and look at 25 and 26. And I think this is talking about not the Messianic age. Sometimes we come across that. If you want to apply it to the Messianic age, then have at it. I think it's talking about the return after the captivity. So let's see what this says. That when I've gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they're scattered. This is after they're scattered into captivity. And I'm hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles. God's name had not been reverenced among the Gentiles prior to the captivity. But when they finally come to the point that they recognize God for who he is and turn, then God's going to bring them back. And they shall dwell safely there, build houses and plant vineyards. In other words, they're going to come back and rebuild. And I'll execute judgment on all those around them who despise them. Then here's your fourth time. Then shall they know that I'm the Lord their God. Well, I like what King says at this point. He says the neighborhood is much improved by this point. Because God's taking down the nations around. It's a better neighborhood. And I think he's right about that. Because that's what he says at verse 26, that I'll execute judgment on all those around. I'm going to take care of your neighborhood. It's going to be better. And then you'll know. So notice the phrase, then shall they know. It's not always talking about, then shall they know that I'm the Lord. But it's not always talking about the same people. That Tyre's going to know that. Sidon's going to know that. Egypt's going to know that in a little bit. And my own people are going to know that. And so it's applied to different people depending on the context. All right. Now that's chapter 28. Now we're ready for 29. Now in 29, 30, 31, and 32 is a prophecy, or prophecies, plural, against Egypt. There are 7 prophecies. You're going to see this chart again. But they're dated. Now the date in the text will tell you in a certain year, but that translates to 587, 586, 570, etc. But there's a couple of things I want you to take note of. And that is, 2 of these are mentioned in our text. The earliest date and the latest date are mentioned in sequence in our text in chapter 29. Now, this is not chronological. And let me make a footnote about chronology. I like chronology. I like putting things in chronological order. If I tell a story, I like to tell it in chronological order. So I like chronology like everybody else. But the Bible's not presented in chronology. It's presented by how an event or a prophecy fits with the story being told. So he mentions in chapter 29, the date of that prophecy was 587. But a prophecy that was the latest of these 7 prophecies, he mentions next before he mentions the next prophecies that actually came before. Does that make sense? And all of these prophecies are against Egypt. So if you didn't get all that information right there, you're going to see that again, but you're not going to see it again tonight. We got to move on. So let's talk about Egypt now. Here's the prophecies against Egypt, point C. He starts with the sin of Egypt. So let's talk about the sin of Egypt in verses 3 to 5 of chapter 29. It was pride. Now the date, if you want to put a date here, this is the first of the prophecies. We'll number them as we go along. This is the first prophecy. And as I'm numbering them, these are not in the order. They're in the order of the text as we number. Here's the first one, and that is it's 587 BC. That's the first mentioned here in this text. Now, he starts with the sins, and the sin primarily is pride. He said, speak and say, I'm reading at verse 2, thus says the Lord, I am against you, O king of Egypt, O great monster who lives in the midst of the rivers. 2 or 3 commentators suggest it's probably a reference to a crocodile, and compares the king to the crocodile of the Nile River. And God says, in essence, I'm going to take a hook and I'm going to pull you out, verse 4, and cause the fish of your rivers to stick to your scales, and I'm going to bring you, and I'm paraphrasing, up on the shore, and I'll give you as food to the beast of the field. That's what I'm going to do. It's like taking this crocodile out of the river and put a hook in it and drag it up on the shore, and there he lays there until he dies, and then the beast just feed on him and eat him. That's what I'm going to do to you. And it's because of your pride. What had this one said? He said at verse 3, let's go back. Here's the pride. Who said, my river is my own, I made it for myself. Now, if the crocodile could talk and he said, this is my river, I made it, you'd think, well, how stupid. You didn't make that river. But that's the way the king of Egypt viewed his nation. This is my nation, I made it myself. Now, God gave it to him. And so it was his pride is what brings him down. Now, at verse 6 and 7, here was the second sin. You're looking for this in your handout. They were a threat to God's people. How were they a threat? We'll see. But here is your next time at verse 6. Then all the inhabitants of Egypt shall know that I am the Lord, because they have been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. So when it becomes evident that they were just a staff of reed, and I'll explain what that means, then they're going to know that I'm the Lord. Israel didn't know that for a while. And what's he talking about? I think he's talking about they were unreliable in their help. They had offered to help Israel and Judah. Judah was depending upon upon Egypt to save them from Babylon. And it didn't work. And he says that Israel was using you and Judah was using you like an unreliable staff. What happened? Picture a cane or a staff that's unreliable that breaks. And so notice at verse 7, they took hold of you with a hand and broke and tore their shoulders when they leaned on you and broke and made their loins shake. So you can imagine someone that's feeble and I need help, and so I'm leaning on this staff and then it breaks. And it tears your shoulder and tears your clothes and you fall down. That's what happened to Judah. That's what happened to Israel. They were leaning on the wrong staff. And so because they were a threat to God's people by causing God's people to have confidence in them when they shouldn't have had confidence in them, he said, I'm bringing you down. So you're pride and you're a threat to my people. Now, beginning at verse 8 through 16, Egypt is no longer going to be the confidence of Israel. So notice at verse 9, here's your next time. Then shall they know that I am the Lord. Because he said, the river is mine and I have made it. Now, notice at verse, let's see, what verse am I looking for? He said, I'm against you, and I will make the land utterly waste and desolate from one end to the other. Neither foot of man, I'm reading at verse 11, will pass through. That's still not what I'm looking for. Verse 12 is what I'm looking for. That I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst for 40 years, he said. And then, I'm going to paraphrase in interest of time, at the end of 40 years, verse 13, I'm going to gather the Egyptians that were scattered and bring them back, the captives of Egypt, verse 14. And so what's he talking about? Well, the Egyptians kept very little or no records of their failures. So we don't have much record from the Egyptians about any failure they had. Their successes are well documented, but not their failures. And so we have very little historical information about what this may refer to. However, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Egypt in 582 and killed Pharaoh. And he returned in 568 and scattered the captives. And in 530, then the Persians began to rebuild. Perhaps that's what he's talking about. And so if you followed those dates, there's a period of about 38 years. So I take the 40, maybe a rounding of those years, that they were gone and then come back and the Persians rebuild about 38 years later. That may be what he's talking about. But whatever it is, he's saying that I'm going to take you away. I'm going to take Egypt down, and then Persia is going to come back and partly rebuild, but it'll never be the same. Now, verse 16 you might underline. No longer shall it be the confidence of the house of Israel, but will remind them in their iniquity, of their iniquity, when they turned to follow them. Now, we're going to get the rest of that verse in a moment. But here's the whole point of this whole section, 8 through 16. When Egypt falls, it's going to let God's people know you had put your confidence in the wrong thing. The whole point of Isaiah was you trust in God and not another nation. They didn't follow that. They didn't get that. They didn't buy into that. And consequently, they were putting their trust. So no longer is it going to be I'm bringing Egypt down, and no longer will they be the confidence of Israel. No longer will Israel put their and Israel then is going to realize, you know what? We were wrong in putting our confidence there. That's what they're going to recognize. And then here's your next time you find the phrase, then shall they know that I'm the Lord. A little late. But they're going to know then that I'm the Lord and not another nation. All right, let's finish up with the end of chapter 29. Egypt will be conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and this is 17 to 21. We've got time to get that. and maybe a practical lesson or two, and we'll be done. So this is the next prophecy that's mentioned here. And it's dated at 570, the last of the 7 prophecies. Now remember, we had 7 prophecies on the screen a moment ago. This is the last of the 7. But it's mentioned secondly. It fits into the storyline. And so he said that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, causes his army to labor strenuously against Tyre. They might make a marginal note. That was for 13 years, as we mentioned repeatedly. He never completely conquered it. He destroyed the mainland city, but never got the island city. And he made every head bald, and the shoulders was rubbed low, etc., rubbed raw, and nor did his army receive wages from Tyre. In other words, the king went there and spent 13 years there, but he didn't get enough booty from it, from the war, to satisfy the time that he spent. So God said, I'm going to reward him. Not because Nebuchadnezzar deserves a reward, but it's like I've hired him to do some work for me. We're going to see that in a second. And he needs to be paid, and I'm going to pay him. Therefore, surely I will give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He shall take away her wealth and carry off her spoil and remove her pillage, and they shall be wages for his army. I've given him the land of Egypt for his labor, because, you might underline this, he worked for me, says the Lord. You want to talk about God ruling in the kingdoms of men? There's a strong statement of God ruling in the kingdoms of men. God said, he worked for me. I hired him to take care of these nations. I'm going to pay him for that. I'm going to let him have Egypt, because Egypt needs to be brought down too. And there's his pay, because he didn't get paid for Tyre. I'm going to let him get paid with Egypt. And it's God picturing him as hiring him. It is not a statement of God saying, I want to take care of Nebuchadnezzar. I want to make sure he gets fed. I want to make sure he gets spoiled. But what he's saying is, I'm in control. God's saying, I'm in control, and I'm the one that hired him. And so I'm going to let him have Egypt. If I want him to have Egypt, he'll take Egypt. If I didn't want it, he wouldn't get it. Because I'm the one in control. That's what the statement is being made. But you might underline that he worked for me, the text says. And in that day I will cause the horn of the house, the strength of the house of Israel to spring forth, and I will open your mouth to speak in their midst. In other words, when Egypt falls, then I want it to be spoken, and then, here's your number 8, they'll know that I'm the Lord. They're going to know that I indeed am the Lord. Well, that's the judgment on the nations so far. Now, we're not through with Egypt. We're just starting on Egypt. We just got a taste of Egypt. We're going to go into 30 and the 31 and 32, and that's all about Egypt, because Egypt was a powerful nation. We see their sin, and we see they're not going to be the confidence, and they're going to be conquered by the Babylonians. But these are the prophecy about the surrounding nations. We'll finish the nations section next time.